Jack Torrance. Jack Torrance was a recovering alcoholic, aspiring writer, and loving father who took a job as winter caretaker of the Overlook Hotel in The Shining, directed by Stanley Kubrick and released in 1980. Jack, played by Jack Nicholson, accepted the isolated position to focus on his writing, while his wife Wendy and son Danny stayed with him during the 5-month closure. The hotel manager warned Jack during his interview that a previous caretaker, Charles Grady, had suffered a complete mental breakdown in 1970, killing his wife and 2 daughters before taking his own life. Jack dismissed the warning, insisting that his family would love the seclusion and that he craved the solitude for his creative work. The Overlook Hotel was built on a Native American burial ground and contained decades of violent history within its walls. The building itself was malevolent, feeding on Jack's alcoholism, his writer's block, his resentment toward his family, and his suppressed rage about his failures. Supernatural forces began appearing to Jack, including the ghost of Grady and a ghostly bartender named Lloyd, who served him imaginary drinks in the empty gold room. The hotel exploited every weakness in Jack's psyche, turning his frustrations into homicidal mania. He attempted to murder Wendy with an axe and chased Danny through the hedge maze in a blizzard, completely consumed by the hotel's influence. Jack froze to death in the maze, and a final photograph shows his face among a crowd at a July 4th party from 1921, suggesting the hotel had claimed his soul entirely. His transformation demonstrated how isolation and suppressed trauma can be weaponized by external evil, turning a flawed but loving father into a murderer. Seth Brundle. Seth Brundle was a brilliant but socially awkward physicist who invented functioning teleportation technology in The Fly, directed by David Cronenberg and released in 1986. Jeff Goldblum portrayed Brundle as an eccentric genius working alone in a converted warehouse, obsessed with perfecting his telepods that could transport matter instantaneously across space. He met journalist Veronica Quaife at a science event and brought her to his lab to document his work, hoping to revolutionize human transportation and win recognition for his discovery. Seth's early experiments with inanimate objects succeeded perfectly, but attempts with living tissue failed catastrophically, turning a baboon inside out because the computer couldn't understand flesh. Seth worked for months to teach the computer about the poetry of biology, of life, eventually succeeding in teleporting a second baboon safely. Confident in his success and drunk on champagne after sleeping with Veronica, Seth decided to teleport himself without telling anyone. A common housefly entered the telepod with him unnoticed, and the computer, interpreting 2 separate life forms, fused their DNA at the molecular level. The transformation happened gradually, over weeks. Seth initially felt energized, stronger, more confident, performing gymnastic feats in his apartment and developing an aggressive sexual appetite. He didn't realize he was becoming something else. His fingernails began falling off, strange hairs sprouted from his body, and his skin developed a texture like leather. Seth documented his transformation on video, scientifically analyzing his own genetic breakdown as he lost his humanity, piece by piece. His ears fell off, his face began to deform, and his body started secreting acidic enzymes that dissolved his food externally before consumption. In the final stage, Seth's human body split open entirely, revealing the Brundle fly, a grotesque fusion of man and insect. He tried to fuse himself with Veronica and their unborn child in a desperate attempt to dilute the fly genes, but she escaped, and Seth's transformed body was caught in the telepod machinery. The creature that emerged was so horrifically mutated that it grabbed a shotgun and placed Veronica's hands on it, begging her to end its suffering. Brundle's tragedy was that he remained conscious throughout, watching himself become a monster while unable to stop the process. Carrie White. Carrie White was a shy, lonely 16-year-old girl with telekinetic powers living under the control of her abusive, religious fundamentalist mother in Carrie, directed by Brian De Palma and released in 1976. Sissy Spacek portrayed Carrie as painfully isolated, dressed in outdated clothes, forbidden by her mother Margaret from normal teenage activities, and tortured by classmates who saw her as an easy target. The film opens with Carrie experiencing her first menstrual period in the school shower, having no knowledge of menstruation because her mother never educated her about puberty. Her classmates threw tampons and pads at her, chanting, "Plug it up," while Carrie screamed in terror, believing she was dying. This trauma triggered a light bulb explosion above her, the first obvious manifestation of her telekinetic abilities. Physical education teacher Miss Collins forced the girls who participated in the bullying to endure grueling detention as punishment, and when Chris Hargensen refused, she was banned from the upcoming prom. Chris blamed Carrie for her punishment and, along with her boyfriend Billy Nolan, orchestrated a plan for revenge. Meanwhile, Sue Snell, feeling genuine remorse for tormenting Carrie, convinced her boyfriend Tommy Ross to ask Carrie to prom as an act of kindness. Carrie's mother insisted the prom was sinful and tried to prevent her from attending, but Carrie used her telekinetic powers to lock her mother in a closet, asserting independence for the first time in her life. At the prom, Carrie experienced genuine happiness, dancing with Tommy and believing she might finally be accepted. Chris and Billy rigged the prom queen election so Carrie would win, then dumped a bucket of pig's blood on her from the rafters during her crowning moment. The blood drenched Carrie completely while the entire school watched, and a montage showed her hallucinating that everyone was laughing at her, though many students were actually shocked and sympathetic. Carrie snapped. She used her telekinetic powers to lock all the gymnasium doors, turned on the fire hoses, triggered electrical fires, and caused the building's structure to collapse, killing most of her classmates and teachers, including Tommy, who died from a falling bucket. She walked home through the streets, causing car accidents and gas station explosions with her mind. She caused Chris and Billy's car to swerve, roll over, and explode, rupturing the gas tank and killing them in the crash. At home, her mother attempted to stab her, calling her a spawn of Satan, and Carrie crucified her with flying kitchen knives before collapsing the house on both of them. Her transformation from victim to mass murderer was complete, driven by years of abuse, finally reaching an explosive breaking point. If you're enjoying this, I make videos like this all the time. I'd really appreciate if you subscribed. Norman Bates. Norman Bates was the proprietor of the isolated Bates Motel in Psycho, directed by Alfred Hitchcock and released in 1960. Anthony Perkins portrayed Norman as nervous, polite, and deeply lonely, living in the shadow of his domineering mother, Norma, whose house loomed on the hill behind the motel. When Marion Crane checked into the motel while fleeing with stolen money, Norman invited her to share dinner in his parlor, where stuffed birds watched from every surface, his hobby of taxidermy evident throughout the room. Norman spoke about his mother with a mixture of affection and resentment, explaining that she was ill and that he couldn't put her in an institution because people would think he was terrible. He admitted his mother was cruel sometimes, but insisted she was harmless, that she goes a little mad sometimes, and we all go a little mad sometimes. After their conversation, Marion decided to return the stolen money and start fresh, unaware Norman was watching her undress through a peephole in the wall. A figure resembling an elderly woman entered the bathroom while Marion showered and stabbed her to death in one of cinema's most iconic murder sequences. Norman discovered the body, carefully cleaned the bathroom, wrapped Marion's corpse in the shower curtain, and sank her car with the stolen money in a nearby swamp. The film's twist, revealed in the final act, was that Norma Bates had been dead for 10 years. Norman had murdered her and her lover in a jealous rage when he was a teenager, unable to accept that his mother wanted a life separate from him. He preserved her corpse through taxidermy, kept her bedroom exactly as she left it, and developed a split personality where he became his mother, speaking in her voice and acting out her cruel, judgmental personality. When Norman felt attraction to a woman, the mother personality took over and murdered her, eliminating the threat to their relationship. A psychiatrist explained in the film's conclusion that Norman's personality had been consumed almost entirely by the mother persona, that Norman barely existed anymore, except as a voice, occasionally rebelling in his own mind. The final shot shows Norman sitting in the cell, the mother personality dominant, thinking to himself that he wouldn't even hurt a fly, while an actual fly crawled on his hand. Norman's transformation from abused son to murderer happened years before the film's events, but the gradual revelation showed how maternal abuse and inability to separate created a fractured psyche where good and evil battled for control. Regan McNeil. Regan McNeil was a happy, normal 12-year-old girl living in Georgetown with her mother Chris, a famous actress, in The Exorcist, directed by William Friedkin and released in 1973. Linda Blair portrayed Regan as sweet and innocent, close with her mother despite her father's absence, and excited about her upcoming birthday party. Strange events began occurring in the house, including scratching sounds in the attic and Regan's bed shaking violently while she slept. Chris dismissed these as rodent problems and mechanical issues, unaware her daughter was being targeted by a demonic entity. Regan had been playing with a Ouija board she found in the house, communicating with a spirit she called Captain Howdy, whom she described as friendly and someone she could talk to when lonely. The possession accelerated rapidly. Regan began having seizures, speaking in strange voices, and exhibiting impossible physical strength. Doctors performed extensive neurological testing, including a traumatic arteriogram procedure, but found nothing medically wrong. Her personality changed completely, speaking obscenities in a deep, masculine voice, claiming to be the devil, and demonstrating knowledge of private information she couldn't possibly know. During a party at Chris's house, Regan came downstairs, stared at an astronaut guest, told him, "You're going to die up there," and urinated on the carpet in front of everyone. Her head rotated 180 degrees. She levitated above her bed, projectile vomited green bile at Father Karras during questioning, and her body showed unexplained wounds, including the words, "Help me," carved into her stomach from the inside. The demon spoke multiple languages Regan had never studied, including Latin and ancient tongues, and caused objects to fly around the room during violent episodes. Father Marin, an elderly priest experienced in exorcism, arrived to perform the ritual alongside the younger Father Karras. The possession reached its peak during the exorcism, with Regan's body contorting impossibly, the room becoming freezing cold, and the demon attempting to convince the priests they were failing. Father Karras, realizing the demon was killing Regan's body, commanded it to take him instead. The demon left Regan and possessed Karras, who threw himself through the bedroom window and down the stone steps outside, dying to protect her. Regan survived, with no memory of the possession, her innocence restored, but her body scarred by the experience. Her transformation wasn't willing or desired, but showed how evil can invade and corrupt even the purest souls. Louis Creed. Louis Creed was a doctor and devoted father who moved his family from Chicago to the small town of Ludlow, Maine, in Pet Sematary, directed by Mary Lambert and based on Stephen King's novel, released in 1989. Dale Midkiff portrayed Louis as rational and grounded, excited about his new position as director of the University of Maine's Campus Health Services, and eager to give his wife Rachel and children Ellie and Gage a better life in the countryside. Their elderly neighbor, Judd Crandall, befriended the family and showed them a pet cemetery in the woods behind their properties, where generations of local children had buried their beloved animals. The path continued beyond the pet cemetery to an ancient Micmac burial ground, which Judd warned was sour and forbidden. When Ellie's cat Church was killed by a truck on the dangerous road in front of their house, Judd made a decision he'd later regret. He took Louis to the burial ground beyond the pet cemetery and helped him bury Church there, explaining that sometimes dead is better, but that he didn't want Ellie to experience the pain of loss. Church returned the next day, alive, but fundamentally wrong, aggressive, smelling of death, and moving with an unnatural gait. Louis, a man of science, couldn't explain how Church came back, recognized the cat was no longer truly the pet his daughter loved. Tragedy struck when 2-year-old Gage ran into the road chasing a kite and was killed by a speeding tanker truck, dying instantly despite Louis's desperate attempt to save him. At Gage's funeral, Lewis became fixated on the burial ground's power, convinced he could bring his son back if he acted quickly before decomposition progressed. Rachel and Judd both tried to stop him, explaining that what comes back isn't the same. The burial ground was evil and corrupted everything it touched. Lewis ignored them, driven mad by grief. He drugged Rachel's father at the funeral, stole Gage's body from the cemetery, and carried his son's corpse to the burial ground, burying him in the cursed soil. Gage returned, but he came back possessed by the malevolent entity that controlled the burial ground, speaking with an adult voice, wielding a scalpel from Lewis's medical bag, and murdering Judd Crandall and Rachel Creed with calculated cruelty. Lewis was forced to kill his own son a second time with a lethal injection, then burned Judd's house with Gage inside to stop the creature wearing his child's face. In the film's darkest turn, Lewis then exhumed Rachel's body and buried her in the cemetery, convinced that this time it would work because she'd died more recently. The film ends with Rachel returning to Lewis, her face dead and twisted, proving he'd learned nothing from the horror he'd unleashed. Lewis's transformation from rational doctor to someone who repeatedly violated death showed how grief can destroy judgment, how desperation can override morality, and how the refusal to accept loss can create far worse suffering than mourning ever would. Pamela Voorhees. Pamela Voorhees was a cook at Camp Crystal Lake in New Jersey during the summer of 1957 when her young son Jason drowned in the lake while counselors were distracted having relations instead of watching the children. Betsy Palmer portrayed Pamela in Friday the 13th, directed by Sean Cunningham and released in 1980, as a seemingly kind, middle-aged woman whose grief had festered into homicidal rage over 23 years. The film establishes that after Jason's death, Pamela attempted to stop the camp from reopening, believing it was cursed, and that allowing children there dishonored her son's memory. When the camp owners ignored her protests and hired new counselors in 1958, 2 counselors were murdered, and a series of mysterious accidents, including bad water and fires, forced the camp to close. Crystal Lake became known as Camp Blood among locals, with warnings to stay away from the cursed property. In 1980, entrepreneur Steve Christie decided to finally reopen the camp, hiring a group of young counselors to repair the facilities and prepare for campers. Pamela, the camp's former cook who never recovered from Jason's death, learned of the reopening and began systematically murdering the counselors, one by one. She killed them with arrows, axes, and knives, each death brutal and personal, driven by her belief that negligent counselors killed her son and all counselors were guilty by association. The film's twist, revealed in the final act, was that the killer wasn't Jason, but his mother, that Pamela had been the murderer all along, and that she heard Jason's voice commanding her to kill. The final girl, Alice Hardy, discovered Pamela wearing a sweater and heard her speaking in a child's voice, saying, "Kill her mommy, she can't hide," revealing Pamela's fractured psychology. Pamela explained to Alice that Jason was her only child, that he wasn't a very good swimmer, that the counselors were making love while he drowned, and that today was Friday the 13th, Jason's birthday. Alice fought back, ultimately decapitating Pamela with a machete, ending the killing spree. Pamela's legacy extended beyond her death. Her son Jason, who had actually survived the drowning and lived wild in the woods, witnessed his mother's death from the shadows and took up her mission in the sequels, becoming the franchise's iconic villain. Pamela's transformation from grieving mother to serial killer established the template for the entire Friday the 13th series, showing how parental love, twisted by loss and rage, can become something monstrous, and how trauma can echo through generations. If you enjoyed this, consider subscribing so you catch every new upload. Thanks for watching.